In the winter of 1834, in a small Connecticut town, the young seminary student Daniel Hartwell discovered something that would shake his faith forever. Hidden beneath the floorboards of Elmwood Church's vestry, he found a collection of documents that revealed the most elaborate fraud scheme ever conceived within the walls of a house of worship. These weren't ordinary church records. They were falsified wills, altered property deeds, and detailed accounts of midnight auctions where the belongings of the dead were sold to the highest bidder. What Daniel uncovered that cold February night would expose a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of their small community. Before we dive into this dark chapter of American religious history, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the shadows of the past. Also, leave a comment telling us what city and country you're listening from. We love connecting with our global audience of mystery enthusiasts. Now, let's uncover the truth behind those forbidden midnight sermons. To understand the full scope of this scandal, we must first travel back to the harsh winter of 1834, to a small town in Connecticut, where faith and greed would collide in the most unexpected way. According to the fragmentary records and testimonies that have survived to this day, the events began to unfold in the most ordinary of circumstances, though what really happened during those midnight hours may never be fully known. The town of Millbrook, Connecticut, nestled in the rolling hills of New Haven County, was home to fewer than 800 souls in the winter of 1834. Like many New England communities of the era, it was built around a central green, where the Episcopal Church of St. Michael, known locally as Elmwood Church due to the massive elm trees that surrounded its stone walls, stood as the spiritual heart of the community. The church itself was a modest Gothic revival structure, built in 1798 with local fieldstone and adorned with tall, narrow windows that cast long shadows across the wooden pews during Sunday services. The building's most distinctive feature was its bell tower, which housed a bronze bell cast in Boston that called the faithful to worship twice each Sunday, its resonant tones echoing across the snow-covered hills. Reverend Josiah Elmwood, a man of 52 years with graying temples and piercing blue eyes, had served as the church's pastor for nearly 2 decades. He was respected throughout the community not only for his eloquent sermons, but also for his apparent dedication to the spiritual welfare of his congregation. Elmwood was known for his midnight vigils, often seen through the church windows late at night, presumably in prayer or preparation for the next day's services. The congregation consisted primarily of local farmers, merchants, and tradesmen, along with their families. Among the more prosperous members was Samuel Whitmore, who owned the town's largest general store, Dr. Edmund Thorne, the community's only physician, and James Blackwood, a lawyer who handled most of the town's legal affairs. These men, along with their wives, occupied the front pews during Sunday services and contributed most generously to the church's various charitable endeavors. It was into this seemingly peaceful community that Daniel Hartwell arrived in the autumn of 1833. The 24-year-old seminary student from Hartford had been assigned to Elmwood Church as part of his final year of theological training. Daniel was an earnest young man with dark hair and thoughtful brown eyes, driven by a genuine desire to serve God and help others. He had accepted the position as assistant to Reverend Elmwood with great enthusiasm, viewing it as an opportunity to learn from one of Connecticut's most respected clergymen. On the night of February 15th, 1834, Daniel's perception of his mentor and the church itself would change forever. He had been living in a small room above the church's vestry, an arrangement that provided him with modest accommodations while allowing him to assist with the church's daily operations. That particular evening, a fierce snowstorm had blanketed the town, and Daniel had retired early, exhausted from helping several families dig out from the heavy snowfall. It was past midnight when he was awakened by the sound of footsteps below. At first, he assumed it was Reverend Elmwood conducting one of his late-night prayer sessions. However, as Daniel listened more carefully, he could distinguish multiple voices. at least 6 or 7 people moving about in the church's main sanctuary. Curious and concerned about potential intruders, Daniel crept down the narrow wooden stairs that led from his room to the vestry. The voices grew clearer as he approached, and what he heard made his blood run cold. Rather than prayers or hymns, he could hear the unmistakable sounds of an auction. Bids being called out, prices being negotiated, and the satisfied murmurs of successful purchasers. Through a crack in the vestry door, Daniel peered into the main sanctuary. The scene before him was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The church pews had been pushed aside to create an open space, and in the center, illuminated by numerous oil lamps, stood several tables laden with objects he recognized as belonging to recently deceased members of the congregation. There was Mrs. Margaret Prescott's silver tea service, which Daniel remembered from his visits to comfort the family after her death, just 3 weeks earlier. On another table, he saw the leather-bound books that had belonged to old Thomas Crane, the town's former schoolmaster who had passed away the previous month. Most shocking of all was the presence of official-looking documents being passed between the bidders, papers that appeared to be wills and property deeds. The discovery of this midnight auction left Daniel in a state of profound confusion and distress. Over the following days, he found himself unable to concentrate on his duties, constantly replaying the scene he had witnessed. He began to pay closer attention to Reverend Elmwood's behavior, noting patterns he had previously dismissed as mere dedication to his pastoral duties. The Reverend's midnight vigils occurred with suspicious regularity, always on the nights following funerals of prominent community members. Moreover, Daniel noticed that Elmwood seemed unusually well informed about the financial affairs of his parishioners, often making casual references to property values and inheritance matters that seemed inappropriate for a man of the cloth. As winter gave way to spring, Daniel's investigation led him to make a disturbing connection. He began to notice that families who had recently lost a loved one often seemed surprised by the contents of their relatives' wills. The widow, Sarah Melton, for instance, had expressed bewilderment to Daniel about her husband's decision to leave his valuable farmland to the church rather than to their children. Similarly, the children of merchant Robert Finch seemed genuinely shocked to learn that their father had allegedly bequeathed his entire inventory to a group of local businessmen rather than to his own family. Daniel's growing suspicions were further confirmed when he overheard a conversation between Reverend Elmwood and Samuel Whitmore outside the church after a Sunday service. The two men spoke in hushed tones about the arrangements for Thursday night and ensuring the proper documentation was in place. When they noticed Daniel approaching, they quickly changed the subject to more mundane church matters. The web of deception that Daniel was uncovering went far deeper than simple grave robbery. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you discovered such corruption in your own community? Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel began conducting his own investigation. He started by carefully examining the church's financial records, which were kept in a locked cabinet in the vestry. Using skills he had learned during his seminary training in document analysis, he discovered several irregularities in the church's accounting. Large sums of money appeared to be flowing through the church's accounts with no clear source or justification. More troubling still were the discrepancies he found in the records of recent funerals. In each case, the church had charged the deceased's family for a simple burial service, but the actual expenses recorded in the books were significantly higher. The difference, Daniel realized, was likely going toward the elaborate preparations for the midnight auctions. Daniel's investigation took a more dangerous turn when he decided to examine the locked filing cabinet in Reverend Elmwood's private study. Late one evening, while the Reverend was away visiting a supposedly sick parishioner, Daniel picked the lock and began searching through the documents inside. What he found exceeded his worst fears. The cabinet contained dozens of original wills and property deeds, alongside what appeared to be forged versions of the same documents. The forgeries were remarkably sophisticated, using paper that appeared aged and ink that matched the original documents. Most disturbing of all was a ledger book that detailed the entire operation. which families were being targeted, what their assets were worth, and how the profits from the midnight auctions were being distributed among the participants. According to the ledger, the scheme had been operating for nearly 3 years. Reverend Elmwood had been using his position of trust to identify dying parishioners who possessed valuable assets. Working with James Blackwood, the lawyer, and Dr. Edmund Thorne, the physician, he would time his visits to dying congregation members to coincide with their final moments. During these visits, while family members were grieving and distracted, the conspirators would either coerce the dying person into signing a new will or simply replace the original document with a forgery after their death. The scope of the conspiracy became clear to Daniel as he studied the ledger entries. The scheme wasn't limited to just the 3 primary conspirators. Samuel Whitmore, the store owner, served as the primary buyer for household goods and personal effects, purchasing items at the midnight auctions for a fraction of their value and then selling them to unsuspecting customers in neighboring towns. The town's clerk, Benjamin Porter, was involved in filing the falsified documents with the county records office, ensuring that the forged wills and deeds would appear legitimate to anyone who might question them. Even more shocking was the discovery that the conspiracy extended beyond Millbrook. The ledger contained correspondence with similar networks in other Connecticut towns, suggesting that this was part of a broader fraud operation affecting multiple communities throughout the state. The letters detailed plans to expand the scheme and included instructions for identifying and targeting the most vulnerable members of each congregation. Daniel's investigation revealed that the conspirators had been particularly ruthless in their selection of victims. They targeted elderly widows and widowers with no close family members, individuals with valuable property but complicated family relationships, and anyone who might be isolated or confused during their final illness. The psychological manipulation was systematic and cruel, taking advantage of people's faith and trust in their spiritual leaders. As Daniel pieced together the full extent of the fraud, he realized that dozens of families had been cheated out of their rightful inheritances. The total value of the stolen assets likely exceeded $10,000, an enormous sum for a small Connecticut town in 1834. The conspirators had been careful to limit their thefts to amounts that wouldn't attract outside attention, but the cumulative effect had been devastating to the community's economic stability. Just when Daniel thought he had uncovered the worst of the conspiracy, he discovered something that would put his own life in danger. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries like this one. Trust us, they'll thank you for it. Now, let's see how Daniel's investigation took a deadly turn. Daniel's investigation reached its climax on the night of April 3rd, 1834. He had learned from the ledger that another midnight auction was scheduled for that evening, following the recent death of elderly Marcus Henley, a retired merchant who had died the previous week. Daniel had noticed that Henley's nephew, who lived in Boston, seemed surprised by the contents of his uncle's will, which left the majority of the estate to the church rather than to his family. Determined to gather evidence that would expose the conspiracy, Daniel positioned himself in the church's bell tower, where he could observe the proceedings below while remaining hidden. Armed with paper and ink, he planned to document the entire auction and identify all the participants. The auction began shortly after midnight, with Reverend Elmwood presiding over the proceedings like a master of ceremonies. Daniel watched in horror as the conspirators systematically sold off Marcus Henley's possessions, including valuable books, silver candlesticks, and even the man's gold pocket watch, items that should have rightfully belonged to his nephew. The most shocking moment came when James Blackwood presented what he claimed was a newly discovered property deed, suggesting that Henley had secretly purchased additional land in the months before his death. The deed, which Daniel could see was obviously forged, purported to transfer ownership of this land to Samuel Whitmore for a nominal sum. The document was being offered for sale to the highest bidder, with the winner gaining legal ownership of property that had never actually belonged to the deceased. As Daniel watched the proceedings, he realized that this wasn't just theft. It was a form of spiritual corruption that violated everything he had been taught about the sanctity of death and the responsibilities of religious leadership. The conspirators weren't just stealing money and property, they were desecrating the memory of the dead and exploiting the grief of their families. Daniel's documentation of the auction was interrupted when he accidentally knocked over a small oil lamp he had brought with him to the bell tower. The sound echoed through the church, and within moments the auction had stopped. Daniel could hear footsteps climbing the stairs toward his hiding place, and he realized that his investigation had been discovered. Faced with the choice between confronting the conspirators directly or seeking help from outside authorities, Daniel chose to flee the church and ride through the night to the county seat in New Haven. There, he presented his evidence to the sheriff and the county prosecutor, who were initially skeptical of such serious accusations against a respected clergyman. However, Daniel's detailed documentation and the physical evidence he had collected, including photocopies of the forged documents and the ledger entries, were too compelling to ignore. Within a week, a joint investigation by county and state authorities had confirmed the existence of the fraud scheme. The arrests began on April 15, 1834. Reverend Josiah Elmwood, James Blackwood, Dr. Edmund Thorne, Samuel Whitmore, and Benjamin Porter were all taken into custody and charged with fraud, theft, and conspiracy. The trials, which took place over the summer of 1834, became a sensation throughout Connecticut, with newspapers as far away as New York reporting on the shocking corruption within the small church community. The legal proceedings revealed that the conspiracy had defrauded at least 27 families out of their rightful inheritances, with the total value of stolen assets exceeding $15,000. The scheme had been operating for nearly 4 years, beginning shortly after Reverend Elmwood's appointment to the church's finance committee had given him access to detailed information about parishioners' financial affairs. All 5 conspirators were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Reverend Elmwood received the harshest sentence, 12 years in the state prison, while the others received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years. The Episcopal Church immediately defrocked Elmwood and launched its own investigation into similar activities in other parishes throughout the state. The case of the Elmwood Church conspiracy remains one of the most shocking examples of religious fraud in American history. It serves as a reminder that corruption can take root even in the most sacred institutions when trust is betrayed and greed overcomes moral responsibility. What do you think about this story? Do you believe such elaborate schemes could exist in today's world? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this investigation into America's hidden past, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark mysteries like this one, and we'll see you in the next episode where we'll explore another forgotten chapter of American history. The forbidden files of Elmwood Church were eventually donated to the Connecticut State Archives, where they remain available to researchers studying the history of religious fraud in 19th century America. Daniel Hartwell completed his seminary training and went on to serve as a pastor in Vermont, where he dedicated his career to promoting transparency and accountability in religious institutions. His courage in exposing the midnight sermons saved dozens of families from financial ruin and helped establish legal precedents for prosecuting religious fraud that remain in effect today.